Okay, today I'm going to do a little summary on the chemical digestion process. So there are three food groups: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And all are digested with their own specific enzymes. Yeah? So by now you should know that chemical digestion is to do with enzymes. And so we already talked about this when I gave you the answer to one of the questions on page 83 that you are meant to do as a homework. So we talked about the digestion of protein and carbohydrates in a ham sandwich. So really this is just rehashing that information plus adding in the information on fat digestion. So here on the left we have the different places where digestion happens, or where chemical digestion happens in the digestive tract. So we've got the mouth, the stomach, the lumen of the small intestine, and the epithelium of the small intestine. So the lumen means the space inside. Yeah? So the small intestine is like a tube, and the space inside is called the lumen. And the epithelium is the outermost layer of the wall of the intestine. Yeah, that's called an epithelium. All right, so carbohydrates are things like starch or glycogen. Those are polysaccharides, because they have many units. Units of what, you may ask? And often these units are glucose. Certainly for starch and glycogen, they are glucose. So this is a glucose molecule. And it's linked to another glucose molecule, and of those there are many. Yeah, so that's why it's called a polysaccharide. Poly means many. Then there might be disaccharides such as sucrose or lactose, which we take up in our food. Sucrose is what we call table sugar, and it consists in a unit of glucose and a unit of fructose. So it's also a sugar with 2 units. Lactose also has 2 units. It consists also of glucose plus a simple sugar called galactose. All right, so by now you should all know what polysaccharides are and what disaccharides are. So polysaccharides are being digested in the mouth, or the digestion starts in the mouth through an enzyme called amylase, which is produced by the salivary glands. So it's called the salivary amylase, and at the end of that process you get maltose, which is a disaccharide, just as sucrose and lactose. Then carbohydrate digestion continues in the small intestine. So note that in the stomach nothing happens for carbohydrate digestion. So in the small intestine we have enzymes, or an enzyme released by the pancreas, which is called the pancreatic amylase, and it's very similar to the salivary amylase, and it continues the starch digestion. So if something is a disaccharide, it just goes straight through the stomach and the lumen of the small intestine. Nothing happens to it because they're already very small. But polysaccharides, the remaining polysaccharides, can be quite large still, so they need to be broken down further by this enzyme called the pancreatic amylase. So then at the end of that, hopefully you only got maltose left. Now a little bit further in a part of the small intestine which is called the ileum, you don't really have to know that. Yeah, so up here we're in the duodenum, down here we're in the ileum. So these are 2 different parts of the small intestine, but honestly you don't have to know the difference for your GCSEs. So basically we're further down the small intestine, and now everything is a disaccharide. Now we have a bunch of specialized enzymes, and this one, maltase, is only named as an example. Maltase digests maltose down to glucose, because remember that maltose consists of 2 units of glucose. So maltase, it basically does this. So I'm trying to draw with my mouse here, which is not necessarily obvious. There you go, and we get 2 times glucose out of this, which, the drawing is really not great, but there you are. This is what maltase does. And now finally, glucose is small enough to be absorbed into the bloodstream. We're going to talk about absorption later. That's it for carbohydrates. Protein digestion. So proteins are not digested at all in the mouth. They are first digested in the stomach, where you have an enzyme called pepsin, which breaks proteins down to something called polypeptides. So it's basically shorter protein chains. And you all know that proteins are chains of what monomer? Hopefully you've all found the answer. The answer is amino acids. So polypeptides still contain many even amino acids, but they're smaller than proteins. Yeah, so it's kind of a partial breakdown. And this then goes from the stomach into, again, the lumen of the small intestine. So we're further up here in the duodenum. And the pancreas, which is the gland that was already releasing the pancreatic amylase for carbohydrate digestion, it also releases two enzymes called trypsin and chymotrypsin. And they cut these polypeptides down further to make smaller polypeptides. And then we've got another type of enzyme called a peptidase, and the peptidases, they come from the pancreas and the small intestine. They break down these smaller polypeptides into the monomers of proteins, which are amino acids. And these amino acids are later on taken up again through the epithelium of the small intestine. That's absorption. Finally, fat digestion. As you can see, fat digestion really just happens in the lumen of the small intestine. And so we've got these fat globules, which are insoluble in water. So basically you get these really large blobs of fat. To those are added bile salts. Why? Because the lipase, the enzyme that is going to break down the fat, that is in a watery or aqueous solution. And this aqueous solution, it can't mix with a fat very well. Yeah, so I think I've explained that in another video that I made on answering one of the questions. But basically, fat and water don't mix, as you will know if you've ever made a vinaigrette. Oil and vinegar don't really mix very well. So in the vinaigrette, you're going to add mustard to make it a smooth mixture. And in digestion, we're going to add bile fats. So these bile fats, they convert the big fat globules into small fat droplets. So they build sort of a bridge between the watery solution, which contains the lipase, and the fat droplet. And so lots of different fat droplets mean that there is a much larger surface area for the lipase to act on the fat. And so now we've got the lipase, which also comes from the pancreas, which digests fats down to the fat monomers, which are glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Yeah, so these are the monomers that come from fat digestion. And really there should be an arrow going down here, and then I should be writing, but I really honestly I can't with my mouse. I should be writing glycerol and fatty acids absorption.